The Metropolitan Police have arrested 7 Kurdish activists in dawn raids in London. 5 men and 2 women were detained at separate addresses during dawn raids in the capital on Wednesday, and they remain in police custody. In response to the arrests, protesters mobilised. On Wednesday night, there was a protest outside the community centre itself, with large numbers of people turning out to prevent further raids in Haringey, that's in North London. The police showed up in force as well and arrested 4 further people on suspicion of support for a prescribed organisation, assaulting an emergency worker, making threats to kill, and a racially aggravated public order offence. Kurdish community groups have condemned the raids and arrests, and they released the following statement from an occupant of one of the raided households. I awoke suddenly at 2 a.m. and thought an earthquake had hit. The door of my house was smashed in and 15 balaclava-clad police officers appeared at the top of the stairs and jumped on my husband, brutally beating and then arresting him. Soon after, my 15-year-old son appeared and the police jumped on him and started beating him also. He and I screamed, telling them that he is a child, and then they stopped. In my more than 23 years living in Britain, I have never experienced anything like this. My entire family is shaken to the core, and my son is suffering terribly from the traumatic experience. The police won't even allow us to go home to retrieve his school uniform. I really hope those people get hold of a good compensation lawyer. Not that the Met care. The Met do this stuff, and at the end of the day, it's the dopey old taxpayer who has to pay for the compensation. They just carry on assailing people and beating them up and smashing their doors in. Police are also conducting investigations at the Kurdish community centre in Haringey and say it could be closed for up to 2 weeks. In response, Kurdish community groups have now issued the following demands. Kurdish Assembly demands 1. The immediate release of community members and a full explanation for their arrest. An end to the occupation of the KCC, that's the community centre, so that it can immediately resume essential community services. An end to the criminalisation of the Kurdish community, including the harassment of activists, the delisting of the PKK as a prescribed terrorist organisation, and meaningful UK contribution to a democratic peace process in Turkey. A public apology from the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London in his capacity as Police and Crime Commissioner for London, and a public affirmation of the inviolability of essential community spaces and services, as well as commitment to their maintenance and protection. All seems quite reasonable to me. Now, according to police, the initial arrests were made in connection with a counter-terrorism operation involving the Kurdish Workers' Party, also known as the PKK. The PKK is a proscribed organisation in the UK. A spokesperson for the Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism unit has said this. I want to stress that today's arrests are targeted specifically at those we believe may be involved in suspected terrorist activity. We understand these arrests have caused some concern amongst certain local communities, particularly those in the Kurdish community. I want to reassure the community that our activity is being carried out to keep everyone safe from potential harm, including those within the Kurdish community itself. That's why we started allegedly hitting a 15-year-old kid. We're just keeping you safe. Earlier today, I spoke to Ida Kaiko, an organiser within the Kurdish Solidarity Movement and doctoral researcher at Royal Holloway. I began by asking her about the arrests of those 7 Kurdish activists.
During those raids, people were beaten by the police, piled on very aggressively, and also children who were in the residences at the time were also violently tackled to the ground by the police. People at the community centre were handcuffed and taken outside and made to wait in the rain while the police searched the community centre for several hours. Many of those people who have been arrested are community organisers who are well known in the community and locally in the area as well, who run fundraising activities, supplementary schools, and generally are involved in the running of the community centre and in community activities that are organised there. I think it's also important to note that these arrests are really unprecedented in that the Metropolitan Police has said that these are the result of a long-term investigation that has been conducted over, it seems, several years. Many of the people who were arrested yesterday have been targeted by border stops and surveillance over a period of, in most cases, many years, in some cases, several decades. So this is a huge escalation, but it's also part of an ongoing trajectory of repression and surveillance and monitoring that many of these people have been subjected to for a longer period of time.
So the PKK is a prescribed terrorist organization. I find that term, the law around it, just incredibly strange and arbitrary. A Home Secretary determines whether or not you can support this or that organization, but that's just where the law is right now. What are your thoughts about the application of the relevant legislation in this particular instance?
I think the first thing to say about counterterrorism legislation is that it's intentionally very vague and broad. So it gives the state the widest possible powers to use to target basically whoever they please. So the people who were arrested yesterday were arrested under a clause of the Terrorism Act 2000, which says that a police officer can arrest anyone that they suspect to be a terrorist. That's the wording of it. So it leaves everything up to the discretion and interpretation of police on the scene. Now, obviously, we know that the people who've been arrested have been specifically targeted, but we also have to understand that that is the nature and the role of counterterrorism legislation as part of state power. Counterterrorism legislation, especially in Britain, because it comes out of the policing of movements in the north of Ireland, decolonial movements there, and the intensification of the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, you might call it, has made counter-terror legislation a part of the state's function that allows it to basically target whoever it chooses. So the PKK has been prescribed in certain European countries in the 90s. It was prescribed by the EU in 2002. And that's a really important point because that's when we see the ramping up of the war on terror project globally. So the Turkish state has been pursuing a counterterrorism strategy in relation to the PKK for many decades. But this starts to be exported outside of Turkey in the 90s when Turkey's economic and military power is growing and its influence over states, particularly in Europe, and also on the United States through NATO is growing. So Turkey uses its diplomatic, economic, and military connections to really pursue counterterrorism as a strategy, not just in relation to the PKK, but in relation to the Kurdish population as a whole. And that is exactly because of the breadth of counterterrorism legislation and the role that it plays in a global project of security. Basically, the prescription of the PKK means that anyone who expresses a Kurdish identity, anyone who expresses not necessarily even any support of the PKK, but support for a liberated Kurdistan and a democratic solution in the region, is likely to be targeted by counterterrorism legislation at some point. And the British state has built up a particularly powerful counterterrorism apparatus, both in intelligence and policing operations, in part because of its colonial history of counterinsurgency. And that's why we're seeing this level of force and violence being brought to bear on this particular community.
That's such a useful piece of information. Obviously, anybody familiar with Haringey, North London, is perfectly familiar with the fact that there are many people of Kurdish heritage in that part of the world. Obviously, there's been a significant response by the community there. Could this precipitate a wider kickback from British Kurds and their allies, of course, more broadly, given, as you've already mentioned, the application of law, legislation, processes, the deployment of a whole apparatus, which many would view as really contrary to democratic values?
The question of, could this precipitate a wider movement should actually be phrased, should this precipitate a wider movement? And I really think this is the point where we have to look at counterterrorism as a strategy that is targeted not only at certain community groups, but also the left as a whole. The Kurdish Community Centre in North London is an important resource, not just for the communities in that area of London, but also for the left as a whole. And this is true for Kurdish spaces in general. The level of organization in the Kurdish movement means that it provides a really important infrastructural and political linchpin of left-wing organizing across a lot of Western European states where there's a big Kurdish diaspora. And we can see that the British state has previously, in various kind of reports and investigations, specifically singled out the influence and the prominence of the Kurdish movement as an important part of networks of left-wing organizing. So that's one aspect that we really need to be very aware of. The other part that I think it bears mentioning is that the powers of counterterrorism are increasingly targeted at environmental activists, at pro-Palestine activists, and anti-racist movements as a whole. And this is something that is not just happening in a UK context, but also across Europe, across North America. The label of terrorism and extremism, which is this, again, a kind of broadening of the legal terms and practices of counterterrorism, these are being applied to movements in a really, really broad way. And the narrative, as always, is that counterterrorism is a protection of democracy, that terrorism, as it is seen by the state, but we have to understand that state definitions of terrorism, again, are intentionally vague and really hard to pin down. But terrorism is defined as being antithetical to democracy. But actually, the measures that the state takes in counterterrorism are some of the most anti-democratic moves that the state system is making as a whole. So whether that's, incarceration, indefinite detention, for example, the people who've been arrested this week, because they are being held under counterterrorism powers, they can be held without charge for up to 2 weeks. So even though it has been over 24 hours since they've been arrested, which under normal circumstances would require them to have either been charged or released from custody, they are still being held. And they could be held in solitary confinement up to that 14-day mark. So this is just one example of the powers that the state has when it comes to counterterrorism, the powers that it has authorized itself to use in the name of defending democracy, when actually this is a really unparalleled power to trample on people's democratic rights, freedom of expression, and free speech. And this is really intentionally being broadened out to target left-wing and progressive movements, and we should expect to see more of this. The thing I would say is that I'm hoping that this will really galvanize resistance, not just in London, but across the UK. This is a problem that everyone who is concerned, not only with democracy and free speech, but actually progressive values that many of us hold really dear, all of us should be concerned about this direction of travel and be really aware of what it might mean for all of us down the line. This is not just an issue that touches the Kurdish community. This is not just an issue that impacts certain political diaspora groups. It's something that the state is pursuing very clearly, and they're articulating it themselves as something that they're concerned about. So if you look at the Wolny report, for example, which is not specifically about counterterrorism, but political extremism, they are identifying these different networks of left-wing groups that they are specifically saying are a threat to democracy, are a threat to the state, and must be met with harsher and harsher measures of policing. And counterterrorism gives the state the widest possible powers to do that. So to expect that they wouldn't use those powers would be incredibly naive.
Britain's been accused of effectively carrying out these kinds of operations on the behalf, maybe even the request of Turkish authorities. Can you talk a little bit more about that? You touched already upon the sort of growing geopolitical weight of Turkey over the last 20 years, how that's translating to greater influence in these domestic policing operations and domestic policy in other European countries. But is this the leading edge of something bigger, or actually are we seeing merely the continuation of perhaps less conspicuous actions by the police in years past?
This is a continuation. The Kurdish community specifically has been targeted by counterterrorism, but also other forms of policing for as long as there's been a politically active Kurdish diaspora community in the UK. But this is also, we have to recognize that this is a huge escalation. The community centre has been closed for 2 weeks. People who live in the homes that have been raided have been banned from entering those premises for 2 weeks. One of the children in one of the families living in an address that was raided was not only tackled to the ground, but also forbidden from retrieving his school uniform so that he could attend school the next day. The level of police brutality that we've seen directed at the Kurdish community in the last 48 hours is an enormous escalation. And in order to understand the context in which that's happening, we have to bear in mind what I've said so far about counterterrorism and the British state's particular commitment to pursuing counterterrorism as a mode of power. But also we have to understand the role of Turkey and how that is something that the Turkish state is increasingly using to its own benefit to pursue its own security goals, through influencing NATO, influencing the United States, and influencing various kind of economic and political allies that it has in Europe. So as the war in Ukraine continues, as we're in this moment of, discussing the kind of power shifts of the world, how is the United States going to defeat the threat of China, defeat the threat of Russia as growing powers? While that is one of the main geopolitical concerns globally, Turkey will be able to leverage the power that it has, the geographical position that it has, and the military capacity that it has to basically require other states to carry out criminalization on its behalf. But that's not the only thing that we should be looking at when it comes to Turkey, because I think we have to, again, understand that progressive forces in the world, such as the Kurdish movement, are one of the main threats to a capitalist state-led system as a whole. So the Kurdish movement is proposing and creating alternatives to an oppressive system by implementing basically a form of self-governance based on direct democracy, women's liberation, and social ecology. And that's happening in Kurdistan, and that's a hugely attractive prospect to a lot of people. So when we're looking at the reasoning behind targeting the Kurdish movement, it is actually an assault on those principles just as much as it is, the enactment of state power through these kind of geopolitical reasonings.